So there are a couple more themes that we want to discuss with Little House in the Big Woods, really just two more that we're going to talk about. Themes that I think are worth talking about that are going to show up in other pieces of literature. I'm thinking Charlotte's Web, Farmer Boy. We're going to see a lot of these things. One of them is seasonality and how the seasons matter to the story and how they can even be figurative of what's happening in the story. So there's some season symbolism. And so far, most of our read-alouds, there have been poetry that we've read that has to do with the season itself. And of course, those can be thematic and symbolic, but now we need to start thinking about seasons more deeply. Students are ready for that. The second thing is perspective. This is a story written by Laura Ingalls Wilder about her life as a child, and so the way she views things matters. So let's start with season. So what do you guys see? What kind of seasonality do you see in this?
This is probably the first book that we've done that goes through an entire year.
I think so.
But we are going to have more.
Right.
At least 2 more in 3rd grade that I can think of. And our school year is structured that way. Early years in school are totally structured around seasons.
That's right.
And just that moving on of time. So I made some notes as this book went forward about what they were doing in each season, which we are going to see again in every rural book that we do, every agrarian book. So in the early winter, when the book starts, they're slaughtering hogs, they're deer hunting because it's okay to hunt them then because the babies have grown up. They've completed their harvest and they've winterized their house. In the spring, they do the maple sap harvest. They have the dance at Grandpa's. They play outside barefooted, and they visit town. They go to town and get the things they need for their once a year. And then in the summer, they have neighbor and family visits because the weather's nice and they can get to each other. But they also have to work hard in the fields, so they have the evening entertainment that we've already talked about. The oral stories, sitting around the fire, singing, playing music, all of that is gone because they are too tired because they've worked so hard. Yeah. And then in the fall, which is where our book ends, you see this reliance on the elements because they've got to harvest. And so if there's a drought, if there's a freeze, if there's too much rain, an early freeze, all of that really affects Farmer Boy even more than in this book. But it is really important. Like, this could be your food for the year.
That's right.
So this is like a really important theme in an agrarian book. And they have good fresh food because they've done their harvest. And just the way Wilder talks about the food and the appreciation that Laura has for all the good fresh things. We're going to see that in the Middle Ages too, when we get to the 5th grade, is that appreciation for food right after a harvest versus when it's a year old. So these are themes that are going to go on. This seasonality is going to be all the way through our literature.
Well, authors for so long have used season as theme, as symbol. I mean, you think of the writer of Ecclesiastes, like there's a time for everything, a time for joy, a time for laughter, a time for tears. And so seasonality is such a human experience. And we recognize it. As we grow older, we start to think of, okay, spring is new life, and summer is kind of mature life, and fall is the closing season, and winter is death, you know. But you even see some of that here. It's the spring where there's joy, and it's the summer where they're full on working, and then it's the fall where they're preparing. It's the winter where things are soft and quiet.
Yes,
you know.
Yes.
And so as we get to Charlotte's Web, as we get to Farmer Boy, as you said, the seasonality is going to come up again and again. But the symbol, I think, gets deeper every time.
Right. So, and I think that that's an important thing. Again, you know, just like we talked about the home being a tangible physical thing, and we're starting to sort of bridge that gap between what home physically is and what home sort of spiritually or relationally means. The same thing about the seasons. I mean, just introducing very foundationally that relationship between the seasonality of life and land. And so, you know, and we can show the hardships of winter and the threat of of winter and why they had to salt their meat. So because, you know, because winter is the dead season, right? And nothing is alive. And so you can start to introduce this idea that authors use, you know, constantly about the figurative language of nature and of the seasons and of weather. And so we can see that, you know, it makes sense that in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe that, you know, it begins in wintertime because it's a threat, right? And it's, and there's fear and it makes, and when we can bridge that parallel, we can see why when an author starts out with a beautiful day, we can kind of anticipate maybe what's going to happen in the action of the story so that the student can start to recognize figurative language and very intentional use of setting by an author. And we see that even in Adam of the Road. We've just been doing Adam of the Road, and you know the chapter will start out with, you know, it's a beautiful spring day and the birds are chirping and the flowers are blooming, and you just sort of breathe a sigh of relief because you feel like Adam's going to be fine. Yeah. But you know, when it's a thick fog and he can't see and the mist is, then you just naturally as a reader have anticipation for, you know, an unexpected thing that is coming. And so just introducing that in a very young age for the student makes them a better, more grateful reader, and it helps build appreciation for all.
Yeah, when they get to the Hound of the Baskervilles and they're on a foggy moor at night. Right. I mean, you just that is foreboding. Right. But then when you get to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Aslan is on the move, snow is melting, flowers are popping, life is just exploding everywhere. That means something more than just the fact of the flower. It means life.
That's right. And this book is so helpful because we instead of just saying, well, winter is a time when, you know, things might be riskier, this book is actually detailing exactly why spring is so beautiful. Right. Exactly what's happening with the family. Exactly what daily life looks like in the winter as opposed to the summer. And so this very pragmatic detail really is very foundational in terms of appreciating the figurative language of nature.
And I think it shows the wisdom of these people because you've got Ma and Pa that are using the seasons to their advantage. I mean, Pa goes out and kills a bear, has meat. He puts it outside in the winter, puts it out in a shed of some kind, and it freezes. And that's what he needed it to happen. He used the season itself to do something for him.
To his advantage. That's exactly right. Yep. That's exactly right.
So let's transition now to perspective. So again, this is a book written by Laura Ingalls Wilder about her life, and she's a child. So she is a child. I mean, this is over the course of 1 year, so she's a child throughout it, and it's all about her perspective. And we see some growth there. Towards the end, she kind of has some jealousy of her older sister Mary that she has to work through, and it's not really resolved, but that's okay. But what other perspective do you see in this book?
Well, I think that you said something, you know, important that, you know, a young reader doesn't really appreciate, that there is a narrator to it. Every, you know, there is a voice to every story. Right. And so who is telling this story, and to what, you know, and so to what extent are we, appreciating the voice of this author? What are they noticing that a different narrator might tell us, that a different perspective might offer? So just in terms of just pointing out who's talking about all of these events, and would Ma talk about the dance in the same way that Laura does? And would Paul talk about, the maple syrup in the same way that Laura does? So just just this introduction of just some very, very basic literary terms and definitions and foundational ideas about how we approach a book. But more specifically related to the book, you know, the perspective, we talk about this a lot in the Moffats. The Moffats is, you know, very heavily about perspective. And this book, I think, does the same thing in terms of how our perspective changes the way we behave. And so in the Moffats, Jane, you know, the children have just sort of a rosy attitude toward life. In all of these adventures and threats and dangerous things and a lot of suffering, they just have a rosy attitude in it, and it makes their life so much happier. And so the way we perceive things can really contribute to our contentment, to our happiness, to our feelings of safety. I mean, in this story, I think it's great to point out, you know, the instance with the bear between Laura and Ma, and then Paul. This is happening in parallel, that, you know, Paul was thinking about bears, afraid of bears. He didn't have his gun with him, and he attacked a stump because he thought it was a bear. Yeah. Whereas Laura and Ma actually hit a bear that they thought was a cow. That's right. And so, you know, Laura and Ma actually had a real threat but they
Didn't know it.
didn't perceive it to be a threat at all. Whereas Paul had no threat whatsoever, but his perspective entirely changed that situation. So just introducing that idea, I think, is important for the child.
Absolutely. And I think one final little section, I mean, you even see it, I mentioned earlier, and I do want to wrap this up because there is some resolution here where Laura is beginning to feel some jealousy towards Mary. You know, Mary is making fun of her hair for being brown. And Laura deals with that kind of internally for a while, then finally goes to Pa, and Pa has to sit her down. He's noticed that this is going on, and she's complaining about having brown hair. And he says, "What's so bad about brown hair? I've got brown hair." And she realizes, oh, that's right.
I'm like my dad.
I'm like my dad. I mean, there are just so many little pieces that are just great.
Right.
That little scenes where students can begin to peg on to that idea of perspective.
Yes.
Of narrator, of this matters, how I'm receiving the story from the perspective of the author herself. And so, what a great little book to bring this all together.